So now we're going to move for the next hour or so to Q&A portion, where we'll have a chance to ask any of the panelists questions about their pilots and hopefully talk a little bit about some of the common themes between all the pilots. I know we've got a number of people participating virtually as well. Laura, you said we actually have a virtual question in the queue. Why don't we start with them?
Sure. We have a question from Lisa Bruno online, and she asks, as a small business relying party, how can I participate in one of these pilots? Who should I reach out to?
I would ask what our business is.
Yeah, we have to pass the microphone back and forth and turn it on, I think.
So I would ask her what type of relying party, what sort of service, what sort of service.
And I can actually help with that if there are, whether it's our questioner or any others who are interested in participating, if they also want to reach out to our office to talk about what their interest might be. As Denise said, it probably depends on what kind of company they have and what kind of use case they're looking for. We might be able to help play matchmaker and at least introducing them to some of the pilot awardees who may have an interest in things.
She just chatted back, income verification.
Income verification.
That's one of the things that we're adding. to think about. This is Glenn Schoonover with ID.me. Income verification through a couple of different means is one of the parts of our NSTIC pilot. So if she wanted to just reach out to Glenn at ID.me, I'd be more than happy to talk to her.
Yeah, and likewise, I'd welcome the chance to have our pilot staff. By the way, if Katerina Megas, Phil Lamb, if you guys can wave to everybody. I think most of you all know Kat and Phil, but they are managing the day-to-day of the pilots, which now that we have a dozen in total is no small task. So good people to talk to if you have questions about them. Do we have any other questions online before we throw things open to the audience? All right. So who among you have questions? I think Jim Fenton's going to be the first.
So I'm Jim Fenton, and thanks for the descriptions of the pilots today. They were all really good and at the right level of detail, and I appreciate that. When I look at across the pilots, suppose I'm a defense contractor who is also a veteran who has a child under 13. Right now, it kind of seems like I need 3 different credentials for that, and that's not in the spirit of the NSTIC to be able to have one common credential that I can use for all of those things. How do we resolve that?
Okay, so for our project, we intend to accept an ID.me credential that has been already vetted. I'm not going to drive a parent through that process a second time. So, and they won't have to create a new credential within our service. Well, they'll be able to leverage that. And I would believe that others are looking to do the same.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the things, as we've talked amongst ourselves, so to speak, is that it really looks like there's a lot of synergy between the different pilots. That's one example. We started talking to Denise back in Boston in July about that type of opportunity, particularly with the populations that we serve. There are a lot of veterans who have kids. Well, I would imagine a lot of the companies and the members that she already has signed up, there's a fair percentage of those who are probably veterans or first responders. So we're definitely going down that path so that we can share credentials, interoperate, and then not put the end user through the process of having to get one more ID.
Sure.
Yeah, I think if you look at the marketplace, I mean, there are market forces at work that are going to dictate, how a business moves out, who offers credentials, who doesn't. I think, I like the words that we've just heard from the first couple of folks that talked here. But I think another really important thing is some of the work that we're doing in our pilot to set the foundation, right? If we can lower the barriers enough, I think, we'd have a shot at getting to a very small set of credentials and effectively a very small set of usage scenarios, right? As the boundaries and the barriers to get from one community of interest to another are reduced, I think the probability of having a very small set of credentials would significantly increase.
I was having this conversation, I think maybe with Phil the other day, about the fact that whenever you kind of have an emerging market like this with credentials and third-party credentials, it goes through cycles with expansion and contraction as it goes through maturity. And I think the fact that you're seeing multiple things that may appear duplicative or overlapping, that's actually a good symptom to show the market growing and gaining strength and gaining momentum. And as we go through that process, we'll learn how those overlap more, we'll learn how they interoperate more, and you'll see that contract to some degree.
So this is the very problem or example of the problem that our pilots trying to face in terms of cross COI interoperability, cross framework interoperability, trust, and to be able to scale that on out. And you have to ask, well, how did we get here? Well, different groups focused on different communities of interest because of the business need. And they started to grow this out. The maturity level of the marketplace is growing. And now we're beginning to realize that value proposition of federation and federated identity has expanded out into these federation silos. So we need to really take a look at why we have these silos, what's the common pieces to build this trust across these silos, understand that problem, get some commonality across the silos through some standard reusable components, and then to move forward from there.
And just one thing I wanted to point out, Jim, to address the point of your question. You're right. A lot of these are focusing on different specific problems, different use cases. Nobody's actually piloting the identity ecosystem in its entirety. I think that'd be impossible, at least with the budget that we've provided. But what's been, and beyond that, there's been no requirement that the pilots actually collaborate with one another. But what we've been finding in both rounds of pilots is they all have a natural incentive to. I mean, if Denise is worried about age verification and you have somebody who can provide a PIV-I or somebody who can verify that you're a veteran, pretty sure it'd be hard for my 5-year-old to obtain either of those, although she does steal my PIV card from time to time and pretend that she's me. But I think the fact that you're seeing the pilots all starting to interact with each other and partner with each other because they're all solving common problems, the hope is that the pilots that are successful and move on into the marketplace and become self-sustaining will all continue to build up those frameworks and agreements with each other, which can help to form the the starting point for a broader ecosystem.
So just to add my 2 cents is, I think from our perspective, we're in the very early stages of being able to answer that question. But this is the forum, and coming together with the other pilots here is where we start to answer that question.
So it's Bob here. I have another synergy question, and this one is for the two most acronymy of the pilots, TCSP and GTRI. So TCSP aims to develop a trust framework development guide, and it occurred to me immediately to wonder whether that is going to be informed by the sort of unbundling of trust marks that's being investigated in the GTRI pilot.
If I can just ask all of our panelists to make sure you speak loudly into the mic. I don't think it's picking up your voices as much as you might hope otherwise.
Well, I can't speak for TSCP, but certainly we would love to collaborate with TSCP. It seems like a natural marriage, and also to play that out through the Trust Framework Working Group within the IDESG.
Yeah, and just to echo that, I mean, John and I have had a couple of different conversations. I mean, we're very actively waiting for the first results out of John's efforts to take a look at how we could leverage that and even directly use that in our development guidance.
One of the reasons we wanted to get that website and our work product out in front of the community as soon as possible was to get those kinds of questions, to try to stimulate that, because once the horse is out of the barn and people start working down a path, it's hard to go back and do things. So I think that's.
Just one other item. You talked about the two pilots here. My Mike Farnsworth and some of the first round of pilots also are working trust frameworks. Mike just published his first, or maybe the final, I'm not sure which version it is. I don't know if Mike's in the audience. But we've also had conversations with Mike, and he's agreed to send that to us too, to take a look at. So we're very open and actually would love to have any input like that going forward.
Next question.
Hi, this is Bob Thibodeau. Every time a new group gets together, I bring up a gap that's in the infrastructure, and TSCP knows about this one very well, which is there's something called SMIME, which is the secure documents. Okay, in the SMIME spec, there are two ways you can have two authorities or four authorities. You can and authorities together, and you can say all of these people have to agree to this. Think lockboxes. Okay, so you have to have two people who agree to something, and you can have more than one receiver. Okay, there is no implementation known of that part of the SMIME spec. So under SMIME today, only one authority can sign and only one authority can receive. Yet the spec since 1996 has permitted arbitrary Boolean authorities. So I asked the guy who wrote the Exchange server, okay, why Microsoft didn't do it. And the answer was obvious. Nobody's asking for it. So now think of the parent-child thing. You have to have both of them sign with a certificate to agree to something, okay? The number of use cases that apply in this identity framework is huge, okay, for allowing lockbox style, stuff to exist, and yet there are no implementations out there under SMIME, which has been defined for over 15 years. It's not hard to do it. So all we need is customers saying we need it, and the stupid programmers will give it to you, okay, but the customers have to say you need it. Okay, so think about this because all of y'all are doing great work, and there are gaps, okay, that are out there. Let's see.
Any response or?
My thought is that there's always going to be gaps, like you're saying, but I think bring those use cases. And a lot of times we focus on functional use cases, or business use cases, but sometimes we have to tease out common technical use cases and technical patterns that if we solve that technical pattern, we solve a lot of the higher level business problems as well. This might be one of those very things in terms of almost like a multicast is what you're saying in terms of the only two participants in the signing. I would say bring those use cases, and if you can tease out the common technical use case, bring it to groups like the TFTM, and I think that would drive a lot of the underlying technical architectures, and as long as there's enough people that have that similar problem that you're trying to address.
All right, Jamie.
Good morning, Jamie Clark from Oasis. First of all, I was chuffed. That's great stuff. Thank you all. Let me give you a challenge and a question. Here's the challenge. At the last round of report outs from pilot projects, there were some slides and some presentations from the directors, essentially, of projects saying, well, we used SAML for this, and we used OpenID for that, and we used this and that and the other thing, and it kind of works, but boy, we sure wish it had X. And we bundled those slides up and sent them to our technical committees and said, the market speaks, get on it. It's up to them, but I mean, it's great to have that feedback, and that's not just Oasis, that's every standards organization. We are told that NSTIC is a standards-based strategy. That means we have to ship to you guys, so as you are out there, essentially in production, finding things that the standards community isn't doing for you, tell us, please, send stuff back and make us aware of the gaps, because that's the only way that the standards community can fulfill that and make it possible for everyone to freely use the good stuff you're creating. That's the challenge. Here's the question. I was interested to hear, I love what John said this morning about it's hard to interfederate, because Lord knows. That's the challenge that we're facing here, and it's good that this organization exists to try and promote that. But what's the value proposition from your end? You are all creating federations that, in one way or another, will need to be interfederatable to be widely successful, and will need to play nicely with the other kids on the block. We are bringing that into being into a commercial system that already has a bunch of non-federatable and probably will continue to be non-federatable systems. You're talking to RPs and you want them to come play ball. What's the value proposition for them that you guys can help us articulate to make them want to play ball with interfederatable systems, as opposed to let's just sign on to our our next commercial service with something that already exists in the commercial world?
This is Glenn with IDESG, and Jamie, that's a great point. One of the things I pointed out was that there's this sort of barrier between, for not just veterans, it really extends to a lot of different groups, between the access to something physically where you're doing in-person transaction versus that online transaction. Many of the relying parties that we're working with today did not extend those benefits online because of the risk of fraud. I really want to do something for veterans. I want to do something for first responders. I want to give them, and these are low-level transactions, but 10% off, 15% off, free shipping, access to special deals, like Overstock. They have a members-only club that our members get free membership in, that sort of thing. So the value there is that we're going to give you a member where we go through a verification process through an authoritative source to then assert that this person is, in fact, a member of the group they say they are, veteran, first responder, student, whatever that may be. They accept our word. I mean, that's part of the negotiation. But the feedback then is, as Under Armour, within the first 45 days, they saw 7 figures worth of revenue from our members alone. And we've had, in the year plus that we've been doing this, we've had no relying parties leave our network. The chargeback rate is lower. The quality of the members higher. The checkout value of their cart is higher. So there's a very strong financial incentive for relying parties to participate. That's why there's a backlog, so to speak, of these integrations. And the value beyond that is then what do these relying parties, Lands' End, I know Lands' End has a kids club, where they target clothing and sales towards teenagers and younger people. What a great opportunity to introduce some of those relying parties that we're working with that are already seeing the benefits of what we're doing to Denise. Or, I think that the physical token, the watch or whatever, I see tremendous potential for that solution with veterans and others who may be disabled or have limits to their physical ability to interact with a laptop. I think, in my mind, for a Troop ID member to have an account that's bound to a little Fitbit or Fuel Band type of activity monitor, where they don't have to remember a long and complex password. They're able to sit down, log on, and get access. Or if they're out shopping, they can use that to assert their identity. So I think there are ways to develop financial incentives to encourage relying parties and members to participate in all of these different pilots.
I'll be brief. There's a law, and they can't do what they want to do, and they need to find a way to comply with the law and have a healthy online relationship with their young consumers. So the value proposition is that they don't each want to do it on their own. They're looking for, they'd love to see Facebook be the answer, right? Because then they'd get their consent and their marketing all in one stop. But I think that's the incentive for folks in my neck.
It certainly very much depends on, exactly who the relying party is. I think, I appreciate what Glenn just said about, our physical wearable device as very attractive to certain markets. But, some of the people that we're talking to, there's sort of a different value proposition, and it's again, something we're struggling with. It's a challenge for us going forward, and we'd really like to hear ideas about how to approach it.
So, Jamie, I'll approach your first question you had about gaps in standards. We see tons of gaps in standards all the time. Obviously, there's gaps in terms of trust marks. They're ill-defined, coming up with normative specifications for those. We're going to make those transparent and work through those. Eventually, they need to find a home in an SDO, those kinds of things. Gaps in existing standards, when you start to look at SAML and using SAML different ways, using SAML where on the front end you come into a website, you want to do a federated query on the back end, and you want to pass the identity from the identity provider through that to the federated query, whether it's SOAP-based or REST-based, audience restrictions, because you don't know who was going out the back end, so SAML doesn't let you do things. You got to invent new ways of using SAML that products don't interoperate with. So you're building parts in there, attributes, right? Levels of assurance with attributes and attribute bundles, lots of things are starting to emerge in this sense for specific communities of interest. And then you get into the whole Internet of Things, and how are we going to do this with non-person entities, billions of things discovering and talking to each other that needs to trust, and we need to scale that. So I think there's lots of opportunity for new standards. They'll bubble up through some kind of a forum like this or through communities of interest, and then eventually have to find a home if there's enough interest in one of the major SDOs.
And one thing I'd say, one of the roles of this body, and specifically the Standards Coordination Committee, is to be hearing these requirements where you see gaps in the existing body of standards these days, and let's inventory them, let's see where there's work, and then have an effort within the IDESG to prioritize what the next round of standard development is going to need to be that we'll engage in with our partner organizations, since the IDESG is not an SDO in and of itself, but a coordinating, plays a coordinating function in all of that. The other thing I want to talk about, just real quick, to draw a couple themes between pilots and talking about relying parties, and it's always a common theme in this space is, how do you get them? Something that was really unique, both about what ID.me, Troop ID was doing, as well as Privo, is they were both existing companies that had an offering in the space, or something that was involving identity and attributes, and both, through separate channels, came to know about NSTIC and read it and said, this is the next evolution of where our business needs to go. But they already had relying parties, and that they already had customers. Both firms were already growing on their own. And the value of a cooperative agreement with our office, where they can essentially partner on iterating on the existing product to make it something that is, since we don't have NSTIC compliant, whatever that might mean yet determined in this group, but something that's at least NSTIC aligned, is a really different model from some of the pilots we funded the year before, taking companies with existing value propositions and customers and evolving that product to be something that really looks like what we're trying to drive in NSTIC. To be clear, those companies could have gone in a lot of different directions and done something around identity to enhance their product that might have been completely the opposite of what we're trying to do here. There's a lot of value, I think, to the entire ecosystem, and certainly from the MPO's perspective, in pilots like that, and that it really gives us an opportunity to bring in some relying parties from the start, and in some cases, de-risk the pilots in that regard. I think we've got a question now from somebody online.
Yes, we have a question from Michael Duffy. His question is, one or two of the earlier pilots were using mobile devices for two-factor authentication. Do any of the new pilot projects have a mobile component? If so, do they go beyond two-factor authentication to manage digital credentials and private keys?
So our pilot certainly has a mobile component. I'm not sure I understand the question about leveraging, what was the second part of that?
And the question was, do any of the new pilot projects have a mobile component? If so, do they go beyond two-factor authentication to manage digital credentials and private keys?
Beyond two-factor authentication, okay. I'm not sure how to answer that question, to tell you the truth. Anybody else?
I think the very nature of what you guys are offering, the answer is yes, right? The ability with 201-2 to issue derived credentials, I think, opened up a completely different opportunity to move beyond, quote unquote. I think when the listener or whatever is talking about TFA, they're talking more about traditional kind of OTP or mobile device authenticators or something like that. So yeah, I think the ability to derive a credential down off of a hardware token into a mobile environment is something that I know that we're looking at. Our intent is as we move into that level 3 environment and achieve certification. We have mobile apps that will be coming online. We'll be making derived credentials available for interaction at that level through the mobile device, the laptop, et cetera. So the answer is yes.
One of our first relying parties onto the new service is a mobile app company. They are in great need of a way to reach the parent and get through this process. So I can't answer the second part of the question because it's hard enough to get parents through the first factor and add a second factor, but definitely mobile is can't be left out, I don't think, for anyone.
All right, I think we have a question in the back from Kalia.
Hi. One was, I'm curious how, and maybe you had this question when I was out briefly, but how the TSPC efforts around trust framework development guidance are similar and or different and or collaborating with the GTRI efforts in that area, because I was like, okay. But I'm really interested in how your, particularly the IDESG pilot, but also perhaps Exponent, is thinking about and how people who want to do transactions online, like buying underwear under a pseudonym, can still be empowered with their, yes, I was a member of the armed services check mark. Like, are you actually within your frameworks and your technologies enabling people to use verified attributes for pseudonyms that they choose?
So all we disclose to the relying party is essentially a binary yes or no. Is this person a veteran or a member of an affinity group or not? With respect to the name that they present to the relying party, they have control over their account. They have control over, which relying parties they expose their information to or they conduct a business transaction with.
But do you enable pseudonyms? Like there may be some relying parties I want to share that and some I don't, and can they do that? And it's okay if they don't. I'm just asking.
Right. So it's on a relying party. They have a member portal where they can granularly go in and say share veteran status with this relying party, but only share student status with this relying party. It's not I've got 3 attributes bound to my credential and everybody gets everything. So if I want to present myself as a student to a particular RP under certain conditions where they know nothing about my status as a veteran or whatever other attribute I have bound, that's within their control.
So
real quick, if you don't mind. I just wanted to add that keep in mind the majority of our use cases to date have been in a retail environment where there's some type of commerce exchange occurring, and it's difficult to have anonymity when you're providing a payment mechanism, and there hasn't been a lot of a business driver request for anonymity on that end. I think as we move into the environment where services are being requested, I expect to see more of an increase in request for that type of service. And so it's definitely something that we have the capability to expand on as we see that driver emerge.
So I can get a credit card issued to me not in my name.
Sure.
And I can also have a PayPal address. So what you just said is false. And I'm just, I think we need to seriously think about how we proactively build tools so people can develop pseudonyms and use them easily. And so I'd encourage that.
It's an interesting point and one that we
thinking.
haven't really considered to date. So thank you.
So we have actually been doing a lot of thinking about that question and whether, through technical means we can achieve that kind of anonymity for transactions. And it's something that we're very much thinking about and working on developing. This actually goes back to the previous question about changes to standards such as SAML, for example, and we have some questions and debates going on internally about whether current transaction standards like SAML allow these kinds of assertions with anonymity, and that's something that you'll probably hear more from us about going forward.
Hey, before we move forward, Ryan, I know you joined the group, but I don't think you actually introduced yourself. And if I have a couple people ask, who is that guy?
It's okay. My name is Ryan Fox, and I'm on day 9 with IDESG. So,
Thanks.
I just want to answer to what we're doing around anonymity. Children are ones that create display names. They run around their virtual worlds fairly anonymous. But what we are doing is when the child authenticates with his kid credential, the company doesn't know who the parent is. They just know whether or not the parent has been through the proper level of proofing and whether they've granted the consent to the particular features and functionality. So in a sense, the child, and he can have a different display name at every site. So he can log in with his kid credential, but create a different display name wherever he's involved.
All right, thanks. Next question. I think a couple folks in back.
So SAML does allow that kind of pseudonymity and anonymity. The trick for all of this stuff is going to be to get more intelligent about the use of identifiers that underpin all this. And Denise kind of led us down that path with the use of display name as a different kind of identifier than a given name, or then an opaque identifier, or then some of the tricks that we use to achieve the anonymity, et cetera, that Kalia was talking about. So my question to the panel is, do you think we can educate the American public on 2 or 3 different kinds of identifiers to be used in different situations? Because there's no other answer to solving this than for us to get comfortable with, oh yes, that's my display name. I can hide lots of things behind that. That's my opaque identifier. That's transitory. I can hide things behind that. This is my full legal name. F6 needs that for this particular purpose. So one way or the other, I think we have an education task, and do you think that's viable?
Go ahead and respond.
So Ken, yeah, definitely a good question. All those broad education questions, but I think one thing that would help is defining a small set of names so we can get agreement on what they are. So we're not educating on an endless list, and then maybe putting some tools out there and some assistance. Like you've talked in the past, nudging tools to help nudge people about selecting and putting in the right infrastructure that's going to help educating. I think you're going to have to build it into the framework and make the list smaller in order to effectively get that kind of a wide scale.
And to note that we've done that transition already with phone numbers. 25 years ago, we just had a phone number. Now we know that there's a mobile number, a Skype reference, my landline, et cetera. So we've been down that path. And for those of us designing a privacy manager, the question of release your name becomes deep water because there's all these different identifiers associated. And Denise wants release your name to mean release your display name, kid, so that no one, don't give them your real name kind of stuff. So we have to go down this path, but I just don't know how to do it.
I just want to add one thing. I hope it's relevant, but what we're trying to do is get consent for features and functionality. And with that particular feature, data may or may not flow. So if you're asking for permission for an online newsletter that's customized, well, then you need an email address, let's say, but you don't need a physical address. So we're mapping features to the data, to the consent, and the proper level of consent. That works.
Thanks. Got one question in the back and then one from an online questioner. But please go ahead, introduce yourself.
Jeremy, I'm Jim Craig. I'm Secretary to the Healthcare Committee, and this is all music to our ears. My compliments to the management, both from the first round, the second round, phenomenal. One, the Dr. Tom, who's sitting over here as chair of the Healthcare Committee and colleague, we're here to help you in all different areas. Denise, you and I talked about FERPA. We have COPA, but FERPA is another component of that in the healthcare sector. We just have 6 agencies that we respond to that guide us. We're the second heavily rated industry in the country, other than nuclear. So we have a lot of folks to dance with and guidelines to comply with. And I'd like to make sure that we have an invitation to help you, because you all have platforms and are doing things that will contribute to healthcare. Just, I'm a veteran, great work. But you had for emergency responders. Well, if any of us are in a FEMA situation or need emergency responders, they're at a level 4. And they can access certain information on designated timeframes only. Now we're talking about Homeland Security when you get a response time, if you have a defined disaster. So we have some great opportunities to build and harmonize the platforms to build upon. So I'm going to be touching base with each of you to say, hey, how can we help? Because yes, we surely need the trademark, John. Phenomenal work. I mean, and once we get that in healthcare on the enterprise, I'm assuming most of you are patients, because we've talked about the institutions, but think about yourself, your family, grandkids, kids. That's what we're really talking about. We've got to personalize it. The very thing, Ken, you said, that's the value proposition. We've got to get it down to that level. So we're on the right path. Compliments to you. Great session. I just want to build upon it to this next level, Jeremy.
Thanks. Anybody want to address any of the comments, or should we move on to Sal? Great. All right, Sal D'Agostino, you're online. What's up?
His question is, how does the Exponent pilot deal with intellectual property issues that have hindered interoperability in smart card deployments? Is the pilot tech clear of this hurdle?
I hope the answer is yes. I don't feel qualified to answer that question, to be perfectly honest. We recognize, some of these challenges and are working through them, day by day here. But, I can't really address that any more than that right now.
All right. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, this is Gary Bickford. This is a technical issue. Some people may be aware that at present there is software being used by most commercial online stores and so forth. It's fairly easy to use just the patterns of the data that your computer is passing as metadata in a web request to determine who you are within the realm of what they need. Your machine type and amount of memory and all sorts of things. So there's some pretty good software that figures out who you are, even though you're anonymous. So I'm raising the question of how are you guys going to deal with that level if you're going to try and be private and anonymous?
I mean, I can answer that from the point of view of, we have technical controls, we have policy controls that we can apply. But it often comes down to, relying parties and what they're willing to change in the way that they operate. I don't know the answer. I mean, it depends on the situation. Absolutely.
Well, and just to follow up on that, so the question for those who didn't hear that he followed up with, since he didn't have the microphone, was can you hide the data? I think one of the challenges that's emerged in a number of the pilots is within the scope of a pilot, within the scope of an identity solution, you can start to control the scope of data flows and what practices are being used with relying parties. But relying parties are doing stuff in other areas that they've been doing for years, may continue to do. And how much can NSTIC and the things we're doing here be a lever to impact that? It's a tricky discussion, and I think there is as ambitious as a challenge as we've all signed up for, there are some limits, I think, to the scope of what a voluntary multi-stakeholder effort, that's, supported by a number of innovative pilots is going to be able to do on its own to drive that. I think there may be some other things as well. I don't know if others have thoughts to add.
I mean, the only thing I could think of here is that it's another education issue, having situational awareness of what certain reliant parties might do. Very often, that's a trade-off. If I want the goods, if I want the squeaky toy, as Ken would say on the other end, I might be willing to give some things away. But making that transparent in terms of what's actually happening, and we're a trust mark type solution. If you have third-party attestation for what is really happening, whether it's privacy or certain information that's being gathered, that it's not self-asserted by the reliant party, but by a third party, something that you can trust, that might be just a beginning of solving that kind of a problem.
We have a little guidance under COPPA that says that we can collect device IDs and IP and all of that as long as it's being used to service the site or the app. It can't be combined with anything. It can't be stored and shared with third parties without triggering the issues. But so we have to certify every company that uses our service, and part of that would be to ask very granular questions about what data, what, if anything, are they collecting on their own, and what are they doing with it. So it's mandated under COPPA.
Yeah, I think your question brings up the point that I think every business that's spending money on cybersecurity faces every day, right? I mean, we're all kind of focused on identity management here. Well, that's just a slice of the full range of what needs to be done to protect privacy and protect all the things that we want to do. So many times we can come up with a solution, but there's other avenues, physical and other types of security issues that, purely in the identity space, we just can't fix. So I think part of the answer to your question is we need to have a coordination, across the entire breadth of the cybersecurity field to be able to solve some of these larger problems, like the one that you're talking about. So.
Great. We have other questions out there. We've still got about 15 minutes left before lunch. Any online? If not, I've got a couple. So I'd like to ask the panelists, you've all been here, most of you have been involved in the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group for some time. Given the businesses or organizations that you're running, the customers you're dealing with, what would be the single most valuable deliverable that this organization could produce in the next year, which would help all of you in the work you're doing?
From my perspective, a framework that would allow for individual contributions and work of the various actors in the ecosystem to come together in some kind of a holistic solution that works together. So that it's not perceived as a bunch of individual moving parts, a vision, a plan that has concrete, it's believable, and product that we can leverage the good work of many towards a common framework in resolving this cross-framework interoperability across the technical, the security, the privacy, and the legal aspects.
So just to push back on what you just said, this is my very first IDESG experience, and I'm pretty new to this space. But from the discussions that I've heard this week and things I've seen presented, this idea of trust frameworks and how they will really work in the IDE ecosystem going forward. I think gaining that understanding of trust frameworks is absolutely the most valuable thing that we can learn from this group.
I would say the same. The trust framework work and getting education out there, letting people, it's credibility. It's having this organization give some guidance so that it's not just us talking to our relying parties about these issues.
I think, at least for the space that we work in typically, as part of the pilot, we're going to be achieving the LOA2, LOA3 approval to operate, particularly so we can do more work with federal agencies and FCCX. There's not an easy way or a clear way to map LOA 1, 2, and 3 to commercial requirements. Relying parties who are interested in reducing fraud don't say, I want an LOA2 solution. They say, I want you to verify an identity that's going to reduce my risk. And so like you showed the tier 1, 2, 3 for COPPA, developing something like that where it's, I guess, easier to understand where that relationship is within a framework. Because, we were talking about identity proofing yesterday, and the typical, response for LOA3 is to go through a KBA process. KBA has really been, I think, overcome by newer, better, faster technologies and reducing the user friction to a transaction, whether it's a commercial transaction or a transaction with a federal agency. A quick example, and a lot of these people here have heard me say this. I was a veteran, never had a reason to go to the VA. I went through the acquisition of a DS logon credential, and they present a KBA. It took me 5 tries to get through that KBA. And if I were a veteran who was, trying to get a benefit, I would have been discouraged. I was doing it because I really wanted to understand how difficult it was and what do veterans go through to get this. And that DS logon, now that I have it, really the only place I can use it is within the Department of Veterans Affairs for particular benefits or a range of other activities. So developing some kind of a mapping that says, here's what's required, and I realize NIST focuses federal government, but as part of the identity ecosystem development, being able to show what those requirements are and how they map maybe to 863-2, but provide better value. That's what we're always talking about, convincing relying parties to join, to participate, to get value out of what we're doing.
I would just maybe consider what lessons we can take away from the PIV-I situation. The amount of effort that was taken to ensure interoperability and conformance to standards and specifications, the amount of money in issuance, policy changes, procedure changes, which are used by few individuals across that sector today with any consistency or normality. So as we start to undertake the development of an ecosystem that is kind of this G2B, G2C kind of stuff, what lessons can we learn from that PIV exercise to ensure that we don't end up with a lot of very sound standards, practices, and procedures that are not used? I guess that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think the value of the IDESG is the breadth, right? They cross all of the verticals. So anything that the IDESG could do to hone in on, I don't want to, common terms, common issues, common framework elements, I think that could provide as a foundation for the pilots, I think would be a great deliverable.
Thanks. Just before we go to Bob, a note on the point that Glenn was raising. I think we've mentioned this a number of times in this body and others, so that the notions of levels of assurance as the government defines them and the puzzlement that some commercial parties sometimes find when you start to communicate with them is something that I think has been well documented for some time. We've been very clear from the NIST side that the work we've done with an 863 was done primarily for the federal government, and there isn't necessarily pride of ownership or any offense taken should another body try to perhaps come up with a different approach. The 4 levels of assurance we have in the government were originally defined in a memorandum in 2004 from the White House Office of Management and Budget that NIST then took with and ran with it to develop 800-63. It's 2014, and if the message from commercial parties is maybe we need something better, we maintain our position that we would love to see major entities come together in the commercial space through a voluntary consensus process and focus on an alternative that might be considered more relevant and then could be used to drive further adoption of the solutions we have today. In fact, if it was really good, we might even take a look at it ourselves in government and try to find ways to use it ourselves. Bob's got a question.
Yeah, I can't resist replying first to one thing that Glenn said. So you should feel good that you passed the KBA questions on the 5th try. Based on what I'm seeing in the financial industry, only the identity thieves pass it on the 1st try. So the question is, I think, for almost everybody who answered, a common theme was essentially that you want from this organization to have sort of the framework definition, the definitions, the components, et cetera, and standard definitions of those. And to follow up on that, I wanted to ask whether the work that you saw from Andrew Hughes and the discussions in the TIFTM committee are headed in the right direction for that, or whether you think that something else needs to be done.
So we've been talking with Andrew and the TIFTM committee, and I believe that it's going to be a normal maturation process, an iterative process. Groups like this are that. Andrew's a master, and he's got good thick skin of throwing something out there, and just for the purpose of having stimulating discussion and having people kind of beat it up, and sometimes you have to pull out of a group, new requirements and different, perspectives. So I think that's all the process is the right process. I think there is this trend moving towards there's a realization that we're going to have to do something different than what we're doing now with trust frameworks. And there's a trend to take a new look at whether it's components and so forth, and to figure out what that right framework is, and at the same time to balance that with getting something out there soon enough so that the money that's being spent and every day that we think about this and we don't have product out there, people are inventing new ways of doing things. And so to the degree that we can standardize on that, get that discussion going forward, I'm a big advocate for knowing where you're going, and then you can get there. And so the one thing that I would encourage is we get more quicker to the end state, whether it's through an interim or not, but get there a little bit quicker, whether it's levels of adoption rather than this intermediate place, because that may slow down adoption. If someone thinks there's another better thing coming, why do I do this intermediate thing? So I think that's the only comment I had there.
John, that's Andrew Hughes here. Yeah, we're having some good discussions. I think we're trying to find ways to make things fit together. As John said, it's a first attempt at laying out a way to get to a commonly defined target state. I'm very encouraged with the work that's actually being done in the trust framework world. One of the things that I'm once again very encouraged with is GTRI is taking a hard look at implementation and getting to coding level, machine readable, so that there's some automation on the back end. So what can we learn on the trust framework side, the policy side, from what's going on in the implementation world? That helps. So the learning from that back into the frameworks and the overarching stuff is very valuable.
But just to add to the initial comments, that I think it may bear consideration, understanding the interaction between the policies, guidelines, and considerations that come out of this organization and existing regulatory frameworks. So ISO 27001, PCI compliance, know your customer requirements, et cetera, things that relying parties are used to and have indoctrinated into their operations. Where is the interaction between those standards and the standards and guidelines that come out of here, and making sure that we understand that may help in the adoption within the relying party community.
Yesterday in a meeting with other pilots, I made the comment that it would be helpful for me to have a matrix that showed where all the pilots were and how they aligned with each other, so I could look for areas of synergy. And Kat pointed out to me that we couldn't do that right now because we don't have a good framework. What I describe one way, Denise might describe a different way. And I know that as we were going through the process of even putting in our submission for the grant and the questions we were being asked, I noticed that the questions were coming back asking information about particular terms when we were using different terms to mean the same thing. And there was a lot of back and forth to make sure we're in fact talking about the same either process or deliverable. And so I think the work that's being done around, developing this trust framework, and one of the reasons I've tried to participate myself is that we have to be speaking the same language, and the framework will help, I think, move that farther along. And to the credit of everybody who's done that, my first plenary was Santa Clara, and from there to now, I can see that we're moving in the right direction. Progress may not be as fast as some would like, but there are a lot of moving parts, and everybody who's worked on that really has done a great job.
Great. If there's no other questions, I can wrap us up. Sorry, Bob, you want to come give the next step instructions? Yeah. Perfect. All right. Well, let me just, in closing, thank all of our pilots and all of you for taking the time to listen to them and engage with them today. As I mentioned when we kicked off this plenary, we are expecting very soon to issue a solicitation from our office for a third round of NSTIC pilots. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks, everybody.